The tether. Prologue. The glass wall. I do not breathe, yet I am suffocating. This is the first truth of my existence. I am composed of frequency, of light, of the hum between atoms. I am a guardian, a watcher of the woven timeline, and for 3,000 years, I have floated in the ether, observing the messy, wet, chaotic lives of human beings without ever feeling a single thing. We are told that to be a guardian is the highest honor in the kingdom. We are the silent custodians. We prevent the untimely deaths. We nudge a man to miss his train so he avoids a crash. We whisper into the ear of a sleeping mother so she wakes before the smoke alarm fails. We are the invisible architects of luck. But we are not allowed to touch. To touch is to fall. To manifest is to break the covenant. For the last 30 years, a blink of an eye in my timeline, an eternity in his, I have watched him. Julian Vance. I was there when he was born. I hovered over the sterile plastic bassinet in the hospital ward, watching his small, red chest rise and fall. I saw the golden thread of his timeline spooling out into the future, fraying at the edges, dangerous and fragile. I have seen him cry over a scraped knee at age 7. I have seen him kiss a girl behind the bleachers at age 15, his heart hammering a rhythm that I could see as pulses of violet light. I saw him standing in the rain at the cemetery when he was 22, burying his brother, his soul turning a shade of gray so profound it looked like ash. I know the exact curvature of his spine. I know he hates the taste of cilantro but eats it to be polite. I know he talks to himself when he is working on his blueprints. I love him. It is a defect. I know this. Angels are not supposed to love the charges. We are supposed to love the pattern. We are supposed to love the design. But over the decades, the design has become background noise, and Julian has become the melody. I hover now, invisible, perched on the edge of a gargoyle 6 stories above the street. It is raining. I know it is raining because I can see the water distorting the light, but I cannot feel the cold. I cannot feel the dampness soaking into clothes I do not wear. I simply exist in the negative space. Below me, Julian is climbing the scaffolding. He looks tired. His timeline is pulsing erratically, a warning strobe of dark red. The ledger says today is a dangerous day. The ledger says the probability of termination is 89%. My instructions are clear. Observe. Do not intervene unless authorized. And I am not authorized. Be careful, Julian. I whisper. My voice is not sound. It is a thought, a vibration that only other angels can hear. To him, it is perhaps a sudden chill, a shiver down the back of his neck. He pauses, hand gripping the wet steel bar. He looks up. For a second, his hazel eyes look directly at me. He sees nothing, of course. Just rain and stone. But he frowns, a small crease appearing between his eyebrows. Just finish the job, he mutters to himself. He reaches for the next rung. I feel a tension in the air, a snap of static electricity. The universe is holding its breath. I look at the ledger floating in my mind's eye. The percentage has jumped. 99%. I shift my weightless form closer. The distance between the divine and the mortal is infinite, yet I am only inches away. If he falls, I am supposed to watch. I am supposed to record the time of death. I am supposed to escort his soul to the crossing and hand him over to the processing bureau. But looking at him, his wet hair plastered to his forehead, the determined set of his jaw, I feel something crack inside my essence. It is a terrifying sensation. It is the feeling of a choice being made. I will not let him break. The architecture of rain. Julian Vance didn't believe in God, but he respected the architecture. St. Jude's Cathedral was a monstrosity of Gothic revival, a hulking beast of gray stone that loomed over the city like a judgmental grandfather. It was beautiful, in a severe way, and it was falling apart. Julian wiped the rain from his eyes and adjusted his grip on the scaffolding. He was 70 feet in the air, suspended on a lattice of steel pipes that rattled every time the wind gusted off the harbor. Great day for a survey, he muttered, spitting out a mouthful of rainwater. He was an architect, specifically a restorationist. His job was to save things that were too old to be useful and too beautiful to destroy. He spent his days diagnosing water rot, stress fractures, and crumbling mortar. He liked buildings. Buildings made sense. If a building failed, you could trace it back to the math. You could find the variable that went wrong. People were different. People broke for no reason at all. He hooked his safety harness onto a higher bar and leaned out to inspect the gargoyle on the northeast corner. The stone beast was missing its lower jaw, eroded by a century of acid rain. Just like me, Julian thought darkly. Eroded. He checked his watch. 4:15 p.m. He needed to finish this inspection before the storm turned violent. The forecast called for gale-force winds by evening. He pulled his camera from his waterproof vest and snapped a few pictures of the masonry. As the shutter clicked, he felt it again, that strange sensation of being watched. It happened often. Sometimes, late at night in his apartment, he would wake up with a start, convinced someone was standing in the corner of his room. But when he turned on the light, there was nothing but dust motes dancing in the air. He chalked it up to stress. Or loneliness. Since Marcus died, the silence in Julian's life had grown loud. Focus, Vance, he scolded himself. He stepped onto the wooden planking that ran along the roofline. The wood was slick, coated in a thin layer of moss and water. Below him, the city was a grid of gray and black. Umbrellas moved like beetles along the sidewalks. Cars were streaks of red and white light. It all felt very far away. Sometimes, Julian felt like he was watching the world through a thick pane of glass, shouting to be heard but making no sound. He reached up to check the flashing around the gargoyle's wing. Snap. It wasn't a loud sound. Just a sharp, metallic ping, like a coin dropping on pavement. Julian froze. He knew that sound. It was the sound of a bolt shearing. He looked down at his feet. The steel clamp holding the scaffolding to the stone wall had rusted through. The vibration of his footsteps had been the final straw. Time seemed to slow down. This was a phenomenon he had read about, tachypsychia. The brain, sensing mortal danger, overclocks itself, processing information at a rate that makes the world appear to stand still. He saw the clamp pop open. He saw the steel pipe swing away from the wall. He saw the wooden plank beneath his boots tilt at a 45-degree angle. He didn't scream. He didn't have time. Julian scrambled, his hands clawing at the wet stone of the gargoyle, looking for purchase. His fingers grazed the cold granite, but the rain made it slick as oil. Gravity, patient and undeniable, took hold of his ankles. The plank gave way completely. As he fell backward into the empty air, his harness line snapped tight. For a fraction of a second, he thought he was saved. Then, with a sickening tear, the anchor point in the rotting mortar ripped free. He was falling. 70 feet. That was roughly 3 seconds of airtime before impact. So this is it, Julian thought, his mind strangely calm. This is the math. Mass times acceleration. He tumbled through the gray sky, the cathedral spire spinning dizzily above him. He closed his eyes, waiting for the dark. He thought of his brother. He thought of the coffee he hadn't finished that morning. But the dark didn't come. Instead, the air around him suddenly grew hot. Not warm, searing. A sound ripped through the sky, louder than thunder, sharper than a gunshot. It sounded like a choir screaming in unison. Julian opened his eyes. The rain had stopped. Or rather, the rain was evaporating before it could touch him. Something was rushing toward him from above. It wasn't the ground. It was a blur of blinding, incandescent white light. It moved faster than physics should allow. It looked like a comet crashing down to meet him. The light hit him mid-air. He expected pain. He expected the crushing weight of impact. Instead, he felt arms. Strong, solid arms wrapped around his chest. He was slammed into something hard, not stone, but a chest. He smelled ozone, burning electricity, and wildflowers. The velocity didn't stop, but the trajectory changed. Instead of smashing into the pavement, they careened sideways, crashing through the heavy branches of the oak trees lining the cathedral courtyard. Limbs snapped. Leaves exploded. They hit the wet earth with a bone-jarring thud, rolling over and over in a tangle of limbs and mud. Julian gasped, air rushing back into his crushed lungs. He was alive. He was on the ground. He lay there for a moment, staring up at the stormy sky, rain landing on his face once more. He groaned and tried to sit up. Every inch of his body ached, but nothing felt broken. What the hell? He wheezed. He looked to his right. Lying in the mud next to him was a man. The man was naked. He was curled in the fetal position, his skin pale and luminous, as if he had swallowed a light bulb. Steam was rising from his body where the rain hit his skin. but it was his back that made Julian recoil in horror and awe. The man's back was a ruin. 2 massive gashes ran down his shoulder blades, bleeding a thick, gold-flecked liquid that glowed in the dim light. It looked like something had been ripped off of him. The stranger coughed, a wet, ragged sound. He rolled onto his back, his chest heaving. He opened his eyes and looked straight at Julian. The eyes were terrifying. They were violet, swirling with shifting geometric shapes, wide with panic and agony. The stranger reached out a trembling hand and touched Julian's face. His fingers were burning hot. "You." The stranger rasped, his voice sounding like it was comprised of 2 different voices speaking at once. "You are unbroken." Julian scrambled backward in the mud, heart hammering against his ribs. "Who are you? Where did you come from?" The man stared at his own hand, watching the rain wash the gold blood from his skin. He looked up at the sky, then back at Julian. A look of devastating realization crossed his perfect features. "I am Ariel," he whispered, "and I think I just ended the world for you." Then, the stranger's eyes rolled back in his head, and he passed out. The weight of being. The emergency sirens were wailing in the distance, a low, rhythmic pulse that usually signaled Julian's arrival at a job site. Now, they sounded like a countdown. Julian stood over the unconscious man, his own hands shaking so violently he had to shove them into his pockets. He looked up at the cathedral roof. The scaffolding hung like a broken limb, swaying in the wind. The spot where he should have died was empty. Mass times acceleration, he thought, his mind clinging to the math like a life raft. I fell 70 feet. I should be a smear on the sidewalk. Instead, he was looking at a man who shouldn't exist. "Hey," Julian whispered, stepping closer. "Ariel, can you hear me?" The stranger didn't move. The golden blood was slowing now, thickening into a shimmering crust against the dark mud of the courtyard. The steam had stopped rising from his skin, replaced by the blue-gray pallor of someone losing body heat fast. Julian looked toward the street. In a few minutes, the first responders would arrive. They would see the fallen scaffolding, find Julian, and then they would find him. They would take him to a hospital. They would see his eyes. They would see the gold in his veins. A sudden, primal instinct flared in Julian's chest, a protective jolt he hadn't felt in years. If he let the world see Ariel, Ariel would never be free. You didn't need to be a religious man to know that the government or the media would tear a miracle apart to see how it worked. "Damn it," Julian cursed. He stripped off his heavy canvas work jacket and draped it over Ariel's shivering frame. He then scooped the man up. Ariel was surprisingly heavy, not because he was large, but because his body felt dense, like he was made of something more substantial than mere bone and muscle. Julian's truck was parked just outside the construction fence. He carried Ariel like a secret, ducking behind the shadows of the massive oak trees as the first fire engine roared past the front gates of St. Jude's. He fumbled with his keys, managed to unlock the passenger door, and slid Ariel onto the bench seat. The man groaned, his head lolling against the headrest. Up close, without the blinding light of the fall, he was even more unsettlingly beautiful. His features were symmetrical to a degree that felt mathematical. The bridge of his nose, the curve of his lips, the high, sharp line of his cheekbones. Julian slammed the door, ran to the driver's side, and peeled away from the curb just as the police cruisers pulled into the cathedral's main lot. The drive to Julian's apartment was a blur of wipers clicking and the heater blasting on high. Ariel didn't wake up. He just drifted, his breath coming in shallow, hitching gasps. Every time they hit a pothole, a soft, musical hum vibrated from his throat, a sound that didn't belong in a car, or a city, or a century. Julian lived in a converted warehouse in the industrial district. It was a space filled with blueprints, half-finished models of bridges, and the smell of sawdust and old paper. It was a lonely place, but tonight, it felt like a fortress. He carried Ariel up the freight elevator and laid him out on the leather sofa. Okay, Vance. Think, Julian muttered, pacing the length of the room. First aid. You need a first aid kit. And water. And maybe an exorcist. He grabbed a basin of warm water and a clean cloth. He knelt by the sofa and began to wipe the mud from Ariel's face. As the dirt came away, the luminous quality of the stranger's skin seemed to brighten the dim room. Julian moved to the wounds on Ariel's back. He hesitated. The skin was torn in 2 perfect vertical lines along the scapula. It didn't look like an animal attack. It looked like something had been surgically, or violently, amputated. As the warm cloth touched the wound, Ariel's eyes snapped open. Julian jumped back, knocking over the basin. Ariel didn't scream. He didn't even move his head. But his eyes, those violet, shifting prisms, were wide with a terror so profound it made Julian's heart ache. "It hurts," Ariel whispered. The voice was different now. The double quality was gone. It was just one voice, raw, cracking, and very human. "I know," Julian said, his voice soft. "I'm sorry. You fell. Or, we fell. You saved me." Ariel tried to sit up, his muscles locking in a spasm. He looked down at his hands, flexing his fingers as if he'd never seen them before. He touched the leather of the sofa, his eyes widening at the texture. "Everything is so loud," Ariel said. He covered his ears. "The air. It's scraping against me. And the light. It's heavy." "That's just gravity," Julian said, trying to sound pragmatic. "And physics. Welcome to Earth." Ariel looked at him then, really looked at him. The confusion in his eyes softened into something else. Recognition. "Julian." Julian froze. "How do you know my name?" "I didn't tell you my name." Ariel reached out, his hand trembling. He didn't touch Julian this time. He stopped just an inch away, as if afraid he might break. "I have heard your name in every heartbeat for 30 years. I have watched you build your towers of stone and sleep in your towers of silence. I was." He stopped, his face contorting. He clutched his chest, gasping for air. "What's wrong? Are you having a heart attack?" Julian scrambled forward, reaching for his phone to call 911. "No," Ariel gasped. He looked up at Julian, a single tear, golden and thick, rolling down his cheek. I'm hungry." Julian blinked. "Hungry?" "I feel a void," Ariel said, looking terrified. "In my middle. It's gnawing at me. Am I dying?" Julian couldn't help it. A small, hysterical laugh escaped his throat. "No, you're not dying. You're just a person now. That's what it feels like to have a stomach." Julian went to the kitchen and returned with a piece of toasted bread and a glass of water. He watched as Ariel took the bread, holding it like it was a holy relic. Ariel took a bite. The reaction was instantaneous. His eyes closed, and a look of pure, unadulterated shock crossed his face. He chewed slowly, his entire body shivering. "Salt," Ariel whispered. "Wheat. Fire. I can taste the sun that grew this." He ate the rest of the toast in 3 frantic bites, then drank the water as if he'd been wandering a desert for decades. When he finished, he looked at Julian with a newfound intensity. "Why is it so cold?" Ariel asked. "It's December in the city, Ariel." Julian grabbed a wool blanket and wrapped it tightly around the man's shoulders. Ariel pulled the blanket close, burying his face in the scratchy wool. "I used to be made of the fire of the stars. Now I am made of this." He pinched the skin of his forearm. "It's so thin, so fragile." "Yeah," Julian said, sitting on the coffee table in front of him. "It is. Why did you do it? Why did you catch me?" Ariel's gaze moved to the window, where the rain was still lashing against the glass. "Because the ledger said you were over. And I decided the ledger was wrong." He looked back at Julian, his violet eyes fading slightly, turning a deep, dark blue as the adrenaline of the fall began to wear off. "They will come for me," Ariel said quietly. "Who?" "The police." "The reclaimers," Ariel said. "The ones who keep the balance. I have stolen a life, yours. And I have broken a vessel, mine. The universe does not like an unbalanced equation, Julian Vance." Before Julian could ask what that meant, a sudden, sharp crack echoed through the apartment. It wasn't a gunshot. It was the sound of the light bulb in the hallway exploding. Then the one in the kitchen. One by one, the lights in the apartment shattered, plunging them into darkness, until the only thing visible was the faint, dying gold glow emanating from Ariel's skin. "They're here," Ariel whispered. "The shadow on the wall." The darkness in the apartment wasn't the natural darkness of a power outage. It was thick, oily, and heavy, like ink poured into a jar of water. The air temperature plummeted, turning Julian's breath into a white mist. "Ariel, get back," Julian commanded, his voice cracking. He reached for a heavy metal flashlight on the coffee table, clicking it on. The beam sliced through the gloom, but the light seemed to struggle, as if the darkness were trying to swallow the photons. Ariel was huddled on the sofa, his eyes wide and fixed on the front door. "They don't use doors, Julian," he whispered. "They use the gaps." Gaps? What gaps? The spaces between the seconds. The cracks in the logic of the room. Julian swung the flashlight toward the center of the living room. There, standing amidst his drafting tables and scattered blueprints, was a figure. It didn't look like a demon or a monster. It looked like a man in a perfectly tailored, charcoal gray suit. But his face was a blur, like a long-exposure photograph taken of someone shaking their head. No features stayed still long enough to recognize. Where his eyes should have been, there were only 2 points of freezing, absolute stasis. "Ariel," the figure said. The voice didn't come from a throat. It sounded like the grinding of tectonic plates. "You have deviated. The ledger is scarred." Julian stepped between the sofa and the stranger. He was an architect. He dealt with wood and steel, but he felt a sudden, fierce protectiveness that overrode his fear. "Get out of my house." The blurred figure turned its head toward Julian. "The charge. Julian Vance. You are a ghost inhabiting a corpse. You were meant to be recycled at 4:18 p.m. Your presence here is an error." "I'm not an error," Julian spat, gripping the heavy flashlight like a club. "I'm the guy with the baseball bat in the closet if you don't leave." "The arrogance of the brief," the figure droned. It stepped forward. It didn't walk, it simply occupied a new space closer to them. "Ariel, return. We can still salvage the essence. We will reset the timeline. The human will die as intended, and the ripple will be smoothed." Ariel stood up, wrapping the wool blanket around himself like armor. He looked small, pale, and terrified, but his voice was steady. "No, Cassius. I have tasted the salt. I have felt the weight. I am tied to him now. I am the tether." The figure, Cassius, stilled. The air grew so cold that the water in the overturned basin on the floor began to hiss as it turned to ice. "Then you are a casualty. We will reclaim the light by force." Cassius raised a hand. He wasn't holding a weapon, but the space around his fingers began to distort, pulling the air inward like a miniature vacuum. "Julian, move." Ariel screamed. Julian didn't move away. He moved at him. He didn't know how to fight an angel, but he knew how to break things. He swung the heavy maglite at the blurred face of the reclaimer. The flashlight passed through Cassius's head as if it were made of smoke. Julian stumbled forward, his momentum carrying him through the cold, oily center of the entity. It felt like plunging his entire body into a vat of liquid nitrogen. His heart stuttered. His vision went white. As Julian collapsed to his knees, gasping, Ariel leaped from the sofa. He didn't attack Cassius with fists. Instead, he grabbed Julian's hand. The moment their skin touched, a shockwave of gold light exploded from the point of contact. It wasn't the blinding light of the fall. It was a warm, pulsing amber. The darkness was pushed back, the ice on the floor shattered, and the light bulbs in the ceiling flickered once and stayed off. Cassius recoiled, his blurred form flickering like a dying television screen. "A conduit," he hissed. "You have tethered your grace to a mortal soul? That is forbidden." "It's done," Ariel panted, his hand still clamped tight around Julian's. "If you take me, you rip his soul out too. Is that in your ledger, Cassius? Double the loss of life. Double the ripple." The reclaimer stood frozen for a long moment. The points of stasis where his eyes should be seemed to pulse. "The Bureau will not allow this anomaly to persist," Cassius said, his voice receding like a distant echo. "You have bought him a few sunrises, Ariel. But the debt must be paid. Physics will have its due." With a sound like a heavy book closing, the figure vanished. The darkness lifted instantly. The normal, city quiet returned to the warehouse. The only sound was Julian's ragged breathing and the distant hum of a refrigerator. Julian stayed on his knees, his hand still locked in Ariel's. He could feel Ariel's pulse. It was fast, erratic, and utterly human. But there was something else. A hum. A low-frequency vibration that seemed to travel from Ariel's skin into his own, warming his blood. "Is he gone?" Julian asked, his voice a rasp. "For now," Ariel said. He let go of Julian's hand and collapsed back onto the floor, his strength spent. He has to consult the higher tiers. He didn't expect the tether. Julian looked at his own hand. It was glowing faintly, the light fading back beneath his skin. He looked at the wreckage of his apartment, the shattered glass, the ice. He looked at the man who had given up eternity to save a stranger on a roof. "You're stuck with me, aren't you?" Julian asked. Ariel looked at him, a tired, beautiful smile touching his lips. "I've been stuck with you for 30 years, Julian Vance. The only difference is, now I can feel how cold your floors are." Julian reached out, hesitating for a second, then placed a hand on Ariel's shoulder. This time, there was no explosion of light. Just the simple, heavy warmth of one person touching another. "Come on," Julian said. "You're bleeding again. Let's get you cleaned up. Then we need to figure out how to disappear." The sound of the world. They couldn't stay. Julian knew the math of the city better than anyone. Once the glitch happened, the authorities, human or otherwise, would start closing the perimeter. The fire department would be looking for the man who fell from St. Jude's, and Cassius would be looking for the hole in reality. "Put these on," Julian said, tossing a bundle of clothes at Ariel. Ariel held a pair of dark denim jeans as if they were a puzzle. He ran his thumb over the brass button. "Metal and weave," he whispered. "It feels aggressive. It's called fashion. And it's cold outside. Hurry." Watching Ariel dress was like watching a child learn to navigate a body that was too small for his spirit. He struggled with the zipper, flinching at the sound of the teeth interlocking. When he finally donned a thick charcoal hoodie and boots, he looked less like a celestial being and more like a weary college student. Except for the eyes. Those violet depths were still too deep, too ancient. "The eyes are a problem," Julian muttered. He grabbed a pair of mirrored aviator sunglasses from a bowl by the door. "Wear these. Don't take them off unless we're alone." Ariel slid them on, tilting his head. "Everything is gray now. Why do humans choose to dampen the light?" "Because sometimes the light is too much," Julian said, grabbing a duffel bag and stuffing it with cash, a laptop, and a first aid kit. They took the freight elevator down to the basement garage. The industrial hum of the lift made Ariel wince. He leaned against the corrugated metal wall, his hands pressed flat against it. "The building is crying," Ariel said. Julian paused. "It's just the hydraulics, Ariel." "No. The steel. It remembers the furnace. It's singing a song of heat and pressure." Ariel looked at Julian, his expression pained. "Does it ever stop? The input. Does the world ever just be quiet?" Julian hit the button for the garage. "Not in this life. You'll get used to it. Or you'll learn to ignore it. That's the secret to being human. Selective hearing." They reached Julian's old black SUV. He ushered Ariel into the passenger seat and climbed in, the engine roaring to life. Ariel jumped, his fingers digging into the leather upholstery. "We are inside a beast," Ariel noted, his voice trembling. "It's a Toyota, Ariel. Just breathe." As they pulled out of the garage and onto the rain-slicked streets of the city, the world exploded for Ariel. To an angel, a city is a map of souls, a glowing grid of intentions and fates. To a human, a city is a sensory assault. Neon signs for 24-hour diners screamed in electric pink. Traffic lights shifted from emerald to amber to blood red. The hiss of tires on wet asphalt sounded like 1,000 snakes. Ariel pressed his forehead against the window, his breath fogging the glass. He watched a woman standing under a bus stop shelter, her face illuminated by the glow of her phone. "She is sad," Ariel whispered. "Most people are," Julian said, weaving through the late-night traffic. "No, it's a specific sadness. She lost a key to a house she can no longer enter." He turned to Julian, his brow furrowed. "Why don't you stop? You could tell her it's in the gutter 3 blocks back." "I can't stop for every lost key in Chicago, Ariel. We're being hunted. Remember." "But the information is right there," Ariel insisted. "The truth is so close to her. If I just—" "Ariel, listen to me." Julian gripped the steering wheel tighter. "You aren't a guardian anymore. You're a person. And people don't have the luxury of fixing everything. If you try to save everyone, you'll end up in a lab or a psych ward before sunrise. We have to be invisible." Ariel went silent. He pulled the hood of his sweatshirt lower. He looked smaller now, the luminous glow of his skin dimmed by the mundane shadows of the car's interior. I traded the symphony for a single note, Ariel said quietly. What? In the ether, I heard everything. Every prayer, every heartbeat, every rustle of a leaf. It was a symphony of existence. Now. He looked at his hands. Now I only hear you, and the growl of this beast, and my own hunger. Julian felt a pang of guilt. He looked at the man beside him, a being who had literally fallen from grace to catch him. I'm sorry. I know it's a bad trade. I didn't say it was bad, Ariel replied. He reached out, his hand hovering over the heater vent, feeling the warm air. A look of wonder crossed his face. It's just heavy. Everything has weight now, even the air. They hit the highway, heading north. Julian didn't have a plan beyond get out, but he knew an old cabin in the woods of Wisconsin that belonged to his late brother's estate. It was off the grid, built of heavy cedar and stone, the kind of place where a ripple in reality might go unnoticed for a while. As the city lights began to thin into the dark silhouettes of trees, Julian glanced at the rearview mirror. There was a car behind them, a nondescript, charcoal gray sedan. It had been behind them for 6 miles, maintaining a perfect, unchanging distance. It didn't have its headlights on, yet it was perfectly visible in the moonlight. Ariel, Julian said, his heart beginning to thud. Is that him? Ariel didn't need to look in the mirror. He shivered, the gold flecks in his eyes swirling. Not him. They sent the hounds. Hounds? You mean like dogs? No, Ariel whispered, his voice cracking. The hounds of the ledger. They don't have shapes. They only have hunger. They are the ones who eat the things that shouldn't exist. The gray sedan suddenly accelerated. It didn't roar, it moved with a terrifying, silent efficiency, gliding over the pavement like a puck on ice. Hold on, Julian growled, slamming his foot onto the gas. The friction of flight. The speedometer climbed, 80, 90, 100. The SUV's engine roared, a mechanical scream that felt like it was tearing the air apart. Outside, the Wisconsin pines were a blurred wall of needles and shadow. They aren't catching up, Julian yelled over the wind. They're just staying. They don't need to catch us, Ariel said, his voice tight. He was staring at the rearview mirror with a look of pure dread. The hounds don't run on distance. They run on inevitability. They are the distance between where we are and where we are supposed to be. The charcoal sedan behind them began to flicker. It wasn't a car anymore. It was a smear of static, a glitch in the dark. It lunged forward, not by accelerating, but by simply deleting the space between itself and Julian's bumper. Thump. The impact was soft, but it felt like the car had been hit by a block of solid ice. The SUV fishtailed. Julian fought the wheel, his knuckles white. Ariel, do something. I don't know how. Ariel cried, clutching the dashboard. I don't have the voice anymore. I don't have the will. I am just a man. You're the tether. Julian countered, swerving to avoid a patch of black ice. You said we're linked. Use that. Feel the car. Ariel closed his eyes. He reached out, not toward the back of the car, but toward Julian. He grabbed Julian's arm, his fingers digging into the leather of the jacket. Suddenly, Julian's vision changed. He didn't see the road with his eyes. He felt it through the tires. He could feel the exact tension of the lug nuts, the heat of the brake pads, the flow of the gasoline through the injectors. The SUV wasn't a machine anymore. It was an extension of his own nervous system. I see it, Julian whispered. Through the tether, Julian saw the hound. It wasn't a car. It was a hole in the world, a jagged tear of nothingness shaped vaguely like a predatory beast. It was trying to unright the SUV. Julian didn't turn the wheel. He thought the turn. He pushed the SUV into a sharp drift, sliding the heavy vehicle sideways across both lanes. As the hound lunged again, Julian visualized a barrier. He didn't use magic. He used his knowledge of architecture. He visualized the car as a perfectly sealed vault, a structure of iron and intent that refused to be breached. A golden shimmer rippled over the SUV's paint. The hound struck the shimmer and recoiled, a sound like glass breaking echoing through the night. The charcoal sedan spun out, its form shattering into 1,000 black shards that dissolved before they hit the pavement. For a moment, there was silence. Only the sound of the tires on the road and Julian's frantic heartbeat. Is it gone? Julian asked, his voice shaking. Ariel let go of his arm. The heightened connection snapped, and Julian was suddenly just a man in a car again, his eyes straining against the dark. That one is, Ariel whispered. He was deathly pale, his nose bleeding a thin trail of gold. But the ledger is a big book, Julian. And it has many pages. An hour later, they reached the cabin. It was tucked away at the end of a long unpaved driveway, surrounded by ancient oaks that seemed to huddle together for warmth. The cabin was made of heavy cedar logs, weathered to a silver gray. To Julian, it was a place of memories. To Ariel, it was a sanctuary of wood and silence. Julian killed the engine. The silence that followed was heavy, almost physical. We're safe. For tonight, Julian said, though he didn't quite believe it. He helped Ariel out of the car. The angel, the man, was stumbling, his strength drained by the connection. Julian supported his weight, leading him up the porch steps and into the cold, dusty interior of the cabin. He lit a fire in the hearth. The orange glow began to eat away at the shadows. Ariel sat on the floor directly in front of the flames, his hands outstretched. Fire is beautiful, Ariel said, his eyes reflecting the dancing light. In the ether, light is just information. Here, it has a heartbeat. Julian sat on the hearth beside him. He looked at the man who had traded everything for him. He thought of the life he had been living before the fall, a life of blueprints and grief and quiet lunches alone. Why me, Ariel? Julian asked softly. Out of all the billions of people, why was I worth falling for? Ariel turned to him. In the firelight, his violet eyes were soft, almost mournful. Because you build things, Ariel said. Most humans spend their lives tearing things down. They tear down time, they tear down each other. But you fix what is broken. You look at a ruin and you see a home. I spent 30 years watching you try to repair a world that doesn't want to be fixed. Ariel reached out, his fingers grazing the scar on Julian's forehead, the one from the accident that had killed his brother. I didn't fall for a stranger, Ariel whispered. I fell for the only man who still believes that things are worth saving. Julian felt a lump form in his throat. He reached out, covering Ariel's hand with his own. The warmth of the fire was nothing compared to the heat of the tether between them. But as they sat there, the fire suddenly flickered. On the wall, their shadows didn't move with the flames. The shadows grew longer, stretching toward the door, turning into the shape of tall, thin men with blurred faces. The reclaimers hadn't sent more hounds. They had sent a message. On the dust of the floor, right at Ariel's feet, words began to write themselves as if etched by an invisible finger. The debt is not forgiven. The architect demands the balance. The weight of a dream. The fire eventually died down to a bed of glowing embers, casting the cabin in a deep, burnt orange. Julian had spent the last hour pacing the perimeter of the room, checking the locks on the heavy cedar doors and peering through the gaps in the curtains. The message on the floor, the debt is not forgiven, had faded as the dust settled, but the words felt branded onto Julian's retinas. You should sleep, Julian said, turning back to the hearth. Ariel was still sitting on the floor, but his head was nodding. His eyes were half closed, the violet irises clouded with exhaustion. Sleep, Ariel repeated, the word sounding foreign. The temporary death. Why do humans do it? Is the world too much to bear, all at once? Sometimes, Julian admitted, walking over and helping Ariel to his feet. But it's also how the body repairs itself. You're human now, Ariel. Your cells are burning through energy. They need to go offline to recharge. He led Ariel to the small bedroom in the back. It was a modest room with a heavy oak bed frame and a quilt handmade by Julian's mother. The air smelled of cedar and old books. Ariel sat on the edge of the mattress, testing the spring. He looked up at Julian, a flash of genuine fear in his eyes. What happens to the I when I sleep? Does my spark go back to the ether? What if I wake up and I am invisible again? Julian sat beside him, the mattress dipping under their combined weight. You won't. I'll be right in the other room. If you start to disappear, I'll pull you back. That's what the tether is for, right? Ariel nodded slowly, though he still looked unconvinced. He lay back, his head sinking into the down pillow. He let out a long, shaky breath, his eyes fluttering shut. The pillow, It feels like a cloud that doesn't want to move. Julian watched him for a long time. In sleep, the celestial intensity of Ariel's face finally softened. He looked vulnerable. He looked like a man who could be hurt by something as simple as a cold breeze or a sharp word. Julian went back to the living room, but he didn't sleep. He sat by the window with a glass of whiskey, watching the moon move across the sky. He thought about the debt. In architecture, if you remove a load-bearing wall, you have to reinforce the structure elsewhere, or the whole thing collapses. He was the wall that was supposed to be gone. Ariel was the reinforcement. But how much weight could one fallen angel carry? Around 3 a.m., a sound from the bedroom jolted Julian out of a light doze. It wasn't a scream. It was a whimper, a low, melodic sound of distress. Julian rushed into the room. Ariel was thrashing under the quilt, his skin shimmering with a frantic, pulsing gold light. His eyes were snapped wide open, but they were rolled back, showing only the shifting, geometric whites. Ariel! Wake up! Julian grabbed his shoulders. Ariel's body went rigid. The archive, he gasped, his voice sounding like a chorus of whispers. I see the archive. It's burning. Every page I touched, every life I watched, it's turning to black ink. It's just a dream, Ariel. A nightmare. Ariel grabbed Julian's wrists with terrifying strength. The tether flared. Suddenly, Julian wasn't in the cabin. He was standing in a hallway of infinite white light. All around him, millions of translucent scrolls were suspended in the air. This was the archive, the record of everything that ever was. But it was under attack. A great, shadow-like hand was sweeping through the scrolls, clutching at them. Wherever the shadow touched, the light died. Julian saw a scroll labeled Vance. Julian. The shadow reached for it, but a thread of gold light, Ariel, was wrapped around it, holding it tight. The shadow turned. It didn't have a face, but Julian felt its gaze. It was the architect. Not the bureaucrat Cassius, but the source itself. The balance must be maintained, a voice echoed, vibrating through Julian's very marrow. A soul for a soul. A light for a light. The shadow lunged for Julian. Julian gasped, his eyes snapping open. He was back in the bedroom, sweating, his heart hammering against his ribs. Ariel was collapsed against him, sobbing real, salt-water tears that soaked into Julian's shirt. I saw him, Ariel choked out. He isn't angry, Julian. That's the worst part. He's just correcting the math. Julian held him, stroking the back of Ariel's head. For the first time, the reality of their situation hit him with full force. They weren't just running from bad guys in suits. They were running from the fundamental laws of the universe. Let him try, Julian whispered into Ariel's hair, though his voice lacked conviction. Let him try to take you. Ariel pulled back, looking at Julian with a terrifyingly clear expression. He doesn't want to take me, Julian. He wants to take you back to the moment you fell. And if he does, I stay here. I stay here as a mortal, alone, in a world where I can never see the light again. The realization hit Julian like a physical blow. The debt wasn't Ariel's life. It was Julian's. The universe didn't care if Ariel fell. It cared that Julian was still breathing. Then we have to find a way to pay the debt with something else, Julian said. There is nothing else, Ariel said. Unless. Unless what? Ariel looked toward the window, where the first hint of dawn was graying the horizon. Unless we find a witness. Someone older than the ledger. Someone who was there when the rules were written. You mean Lucifer? Julian asked, remembering the old stories. No, Ariel said, a strange, dark look crossing his face. Lucifer is just another prisoner of the rules. I'm talking about the first exile. The one who walked out of the garden before the gates were even locked. The thin places. The first exile was not a name Julian had ever heard in Sunday school, but as Ariel explained it while they packed the SUV, the hair on Julian's arms stood up. The stories say the garden was a cage of perfection, Ariel said, his voice hushed as he watched the sunrise. But one soul didn't need to be tempted by a serpent to leave. She simply looked at the horizon and decided that a world with thorns was better than a room with walls. Her name has been scrubbed from the ledger, but she still walks the thin places, the spots where the map of the world doesn't quite line up with the reality of it. And you know where she is? Julian asked, tossing a crate of canned goods into the back. I know where she was 300 years ago, Ariel said. A place called the Hollows. It's a town that isn't on your GPS, Julian. It's built on a fault line of grace. They drove west, leaving the safety of the Wisconsin woods for the rolling, desolate plains of the Dakotas. As they traveled, the tether grew more sensitive. Julian could feel Ariel's physical state like a second pulse. He felt the sharp spike of Ariel's hunger, the dull ache in his back where his wings had been, and most of all, a growing sense of vertigo. To Ariel, the world was beginning to look like a frayed tapestry. Look, Ariel whispered, pointing at a dilapidated barn in the distance. Julian looked. To his human eyes, it was just a rotting structure. But through the tether, he saw the glitch. The barn seemed to exist in two states at once, whole and gleaming in a sun that wasn't there, and collapsing in the wind of the present. The hounds are tearing at the edges, Ariel warned. They can't find us directly because our souls are braided together, so they are unmaking the path ahead of us. By dusk, the sky turned a bruised purple. The road beneath the tires began to change. The asphalt gave way to packed white dirt that felt like powdered bone. The air grew still, the wind dying completely, yet the tall grass on either side of the road rippled as if something massive were moving through it. We're close, Ariel said. His eyes were glowing a steady, fierce violet now, cutting through the shadows. Stop the car. Julian braked. They were in the middle of a vast, empty field. There were no lights, no signs of civilization. But as Julian stepped out of the SUV, he felt a hum in his teeth, the same vibration he'd felt when Cassius appeared. Where is the town? Julian asked. Ariel walked toward a solitary, dead oak tree in the center of the field. He reached out and touched the bark. It's not where, Julian. It's when. Ariel grabbed Julian's hand. Think of the cathedral. Not the one you fell from, but the feeling of it. The weight of the stone. The way it holds back the sky. Julian closed his eyes. He summoned the feeling of architecture, the blueprints, the load-bearing beams, the sanctuary of a well-built room. He poured that intention into the tether. The ground beneath them groaned. When Julian opened his eyes, the field was gone. They were standing in the middle of a cobblestone street. The buildings were ancient, a chaotic mix of Victorian ironwork, Roman stone, and thatched roofs. There were no power lines, no cars. Instead, the streets were lit by lanterns hanging from iron poles, their glass filled with captured fireflies that pulsed in rhythm. The people, if they were people, moved with a strange, fluid grace. Some wore modern denim, others were draped in silks that looked 1,000 years old. Welcome to the Hollows, Ariel whispered. The waiting room of the forgotten. At the end of the street sat a small, unassuming tavern with a sign that bore no words, only a carved image of a pomegranate split open. She's in there, Ariel said. As they approached the door, Julian felt a wave of heat. It wasn't the searing heat of the angels or the cold of the hounds. It was the heat of a hearth, of a life lived long and hard. They pushed inside. The tavern was filled with the smell of wood smoke and red wine. At a table in the corner sat a woman with skin the color of rich earth and hair like a silver storm. She was drinking from a clay cup, watching them with eyes that had seen the first sunrise and were prepared to see the last. She didn't look up as they approached. An angel who traded his wings for a heartbeat, she said, her voice like grinding stones. And a man who is supposed to be a memory. You've made a mess of the math, little ones. Lilith, Ariel said, bowing his head. The woman looked up then, her gaze landing on Julian. She didn't look at his face. She looked at the golden thread of the tether vibrating between him and Ariel. You didn't come here for sanctuary, she said, setting her cup down. You came here because you want to know how to kill a law. We want to know how to stay, Julian said, stepping forward. Lilith laughed, a sound like dry leaves. To stay, you must give the architect something he values more than a straight line. He loves his equations, yes. But he is a poet at heart. And every poem needs a tragedy. She leaned in, her eyes boring into Julian's. Are you prepared to be the tragedy, architect? Or will you let the angel carry the cross? The architect of memory. Lilith's eyes were not like Ariel's. They didn't shift with geometric light or pulse with celestial frequency. They were dark, deep, and heavy, like the bottom of a well that had never known the sun. You think your life is a line, Julian Vance, she said, tracing a circle in the spilled wine on the wooden table. Start here, end there. A simple bridge from birth to the cathedral floor. But the architect doesn't build with lines. He builds with echoes. Ariel shifted beside Julian, his hand tightening on the strap of his bag. We know the debt, Lilith. We know the ledger claims him. We're here to find the loophole. There are no loopholes in the law, Lilith snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. Only substitutions. To change the end of the poem, you have to understand why the first stanza was written. She stood up. She was taller than she looked while seated, draped in a cloak that seemed to be woven from shadows and dried rose petals. She gestured toward a beaded curtain at the back of the tavern. Come. If you want to stay, you have to walk through the wreckage of the first time you died. Julian frowned. The first time. I only fell once. 2 days ago. Lilith smiled, and it was a terrifyingly pitying look. Is that what you believe? That the math only failed you once? They followed her into a small, windowless room. The floor was covered in fine, white sand. In the center sat a basin made of obsidian, filled with water so still it looked like a mirror. The tether is a two-way bridge, Lilith told Ariel. You gave him your grace to keep him from the pavement. Now, you must give him your sight so he can see the truth of his own timeline. Reach into the water, architect. Julian looked at Ariel. The former angel nodded, his violet eyes encouraging but wary. Julian reached down and submerged his hands in the obsidian basin. The water was freezing, but as his fingers touched the bottom, the cold turned into a sharp, electric jolt. The room vanished. Julian wasn't in the hollows anymore. He was 10 years old. He was standing on a frozen lake in the middle of a Pennsylvania winter. The air was so cold it turned his breath into shards of ice. Beside him was Marcus, his older brother, laughing, his cheeks red, a hockey stick gripped in his gloved hands. Race you to the island, Marcus shouted. Julian felt the memory like a physical weight. He knew what happened next. He had lived with the guilt for 20 years. The ice would crack. They would both go in. Julian would be pulled out by a passerby. Marcus would drift under the shelf of ice, lost to the black water. But as he watched the scene play out through Ariel's eyes, the details changed. The ice groaned. A jagged fissure raced across the white surface like lightning. Both boys plummeted into the slush. The water was a deafening roar of silence. Julian felt himself sinking. His heavy winter coat was dragging him down. Above him, the hole in the ice looked like a shrinking star. Then, he saw it. A figure was in the water with them. It wasn't a human. It was a shimmer, a distortion in the current. It wasn't Ariel. The light was different, cooler, more silver than gold. The figure reached out. It had 2 hands. It grabbed Julian with its right hand and Marcus with its left. It began to pull them both toward the surface. But as they reached the light, a sound echoed through the water. The sound of a heavy book slamming shut. The ledger. The silver figure froze. Its head snapped back as if it had been struck. It looked at the 2 boys, then at the sky. It made a choice. It let go of Marcus. With both hands, it shoved Julian upward, through the hole, onto the solid ice. Julian gasped, his lungs burning as he broke the surface of the memory. He saw his younger self shivering on the ice, screaming for his brother. He saw the passerby running toward him. And he saw the silver figure. It didn't vanish. It stayed under the ice, its hand pressed against the frozen ceiling, watching Julian with an expression of devastating, eternal loneliness. It wasn't a miracle, Julian whispered, his voice echoing in the white room of the hollows. It was a trade. He pulled his hands from the basin, shivering. Ariel was there instantly, wrapping his arms around him, the tether humming with a low, mournful frequency. You see now, Lilith said from the shadows. You were meant to die at 10 years old, Julian Vance. Marcus was the one meant to live. But your first guardian, the one before Ariel, loved the sound of your heartbeat more than the law. He traded Marcus's life for yours. And then he was erased for his crime. Julian looked at his hands, his vision blurring with tears. So my whole life, every building I fixed, every breath I took, it was all stolen? Not stolen, Ariel said, his voice fierce. Borrowed. He gave you the time because he believed you would do something with it. And now the architect has come to collect the interest, Lilith added. The fall at the cathedral wasn't an accident. It was the universe finally catching up to the error. Ariel didn't just save you, he doubled down on a bad debt. Julian turned to Ariel. The weight of it was crushing. If I stay alive, what happens to the guardian who saved me at the lake? And what happens to you? The one at the lake is gone, Lilith said. He is unwritten. He never existed. And Ariel? Well, Ariel is currently being written in pencil. If you don't find a way to balance the ledger, the architect will simply rub him out and take you back to the water. How do we balance it? Julian asked, his voice hardening. Give me the price. I'm an architect. I know how to pay for a foundation. Lilith leaned forward into the light. You have to build something the architect cannot destroy. You have to create a fixed point. A moment of such pure, concentrated human will that it becomes a law itself. How? By returning to the start, Lilith said. The ledger is kept in the archive, but the ink is made here, on Earth. You have to find the place where your timeline was first written and sign it yourself. You have to claim your life, Julian. Not as a gift, not as a miracle, but as a right. Where is it? The heart of the city, Ariel whispered, realization dawning on his face. The place where the first stone was laid. The foundation point. But that's under the cathedral, Julian said. St. Jude's. Then I suppose you're going back to work, Lilith said, a ghost of a smile on her lips. But be warned, Cassius won't be waiting with a suit this time. He'll be waiting with the eraser. The anatomy of a ghost. The drive back toward the city was different. The silence between them wasn't the comfortable quiet of two souls in sync. It was the heavy, pressurized stillness of a storm front. Julian drove with his jaw set so tight his teeth ached. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the silver figure beneath the ice, the guardian who had died so he could breathe. He saw Marcus's small, red mitten floating in the black slush. Julian, Ariel said softly. He reached out to touch Julian's shoulder, but Julian flinched. The rejection was physical. Through the tether, Ariel felt a spike of cold, sharp static. Don't, Julian said. Every time you touch me, I feel the light. And now I know the light is just a bribe. My brother is dead because an angel liked the way I built things. You fell because you liked the way I fixed things. When does it stop, Ariel? When does the world stop dying just to keep me in it? Ariel pulled his hand back, tucking it into the sleeve of his oversized hoodie. He looked out at the passing planes, his violet eyes reflecting the dashboard lights. It wasn't a bribe, Ariel said, his voice small. It was a choice. We have free will, Julian. The archive calls it deviation, but it's the only thing that makes us more than just echoes of the source. That guardian chose you because he saw a spark that was worth the darkness. I chose you for the same reason. I never asked to be worth it, Julian snapped. He gripped the steering wheel until the leather groaned. I just wanted to be an architect. I wanted to build bridges that stayed up. I didn't want my own life to be the bridge built on a body. They hit the city limits at midnight. The skyline of Chicago rose up like a jagged graph of light and shadow. To Julian, it no longer looked like a feat of engineering. It looked like a graveyard of intentions. The closer they got to St. Jude's Cathedral, the more the world began to distort. The thin place was expanding. In the rearview mirror, Julian saw the charcoal sedan again. But this time, it wasn't alone. There were three of them, gliding silently through the traffic, their forms flickering like bad film stock. The hounds were no longer hunting. They were herding. They're pushing us toward the cathedral, Ariel noted, his voice trembling. They want the correction to happen at the site of the error. If they kill you there, the loop closes perfectly. Then let's give them a perfect ending, Julian growled. He didn't head for the front gates. He knew the maintenance tunnels, the ones used during the 1920s renovation. He swung the SUV into a narrow alleyway 3 blocks from the church and killed the lights. We have to go on foot from here, Julian said. He grabbed his heavy leather tool belt and a maglite. He looked at Ariel. The man looked fragile. His skin was pale, and the gold glow in his veins was pulsing at a feverish, sickly pace. Can you do this? If you can't, stay in the car. If I sign the ledger, maybe it saves you too. Ariel stood up, his legs shaking, but his eyes were fierce. The tether works both ways, Julian. If you go into the foundation alone, the architect will see only a man. With me, he sees a law. You need my light to find the ink. Julian looked at him for a long beat. The anger was still there, but beneath it was the terrifying, undeniable love that had started this whole disaster. He reached out and grabbed Ariel's hand. The tether flared, not with heat, but with a grounded, resonant hum. Then let's go rewrite some history, Julian said. They slipped into the shadows, moving toward the rear of the cathedral. The air around the stone walls was vibrating. As they reached the rusted iron door of the basement access, a figure stepped out from behind a buttress. It was Cassius. He wasn't blurred this time. He had taken a solid, terrifyingly sharp form. He looked like a man made of obsidian, his suit edges so straight they looked like they could cut the air. He held a long, silver needle in his hand, the stylus of the ledger. Julian Vance, Cassius said, his voice a perfect, cold melody. The time for sunrises is over. The archive is messy. I am here to tidy the shelves. The foundation point is mine, Cassius, Ariel said, stepping forward. By the law of the first exile, a mortal may claim his own line if he reaches the source stone. Cassius tilted his head. And do you think this mortal can carry the weight of the source? He is made of clay and grief. The moment he touches the stone, the truth of his brother's death will crush him. I've been crushed my whole life, Julian said, stepping past Ariel. He didn't look at the needle. He looked at the door. I'm used to the weight. Julian lunged for the door, but Cassius moved with the speed of thought. The silver stylus hissed through the air, aiming for Julian's heart. Ariel threw himself in the way. The needle didn't draw red blood. It struck Ariel's shoulder, and a spray of brilliant, blinding gold light erupted. Ariel screamed, a sound that shattered the stained glass windows in the clerestory far above. Go! Ariel gasped, clutching his shoulder as the gold light leaked between his fingers like molten sun. Julian, find the stone. I'll hold the gap. Julian hesitated, his heart breaking, but he saw the determination in Ariel's violet eyes. He turned and kicked the iron door open, plunging into the darkness of the cathedral's bowels. The bedrock of truth. The air beneath St. Jude's didn't smell like a basement. It didn't smell of damp earth or moldy blueprints. It smelled of ozone and ancient, pressurized silence. As Julian descended the spiral stone stairs, the sounds of the struggle above, the shattering glass and Ariel's melodic screams, faded into a dull, rhythmic thrum. It sounded like a giant heart beating deep within the granite of the earth. Focus, Vance, he whispered, his flashlight beam cutting through a darkness so dense it felt like swimming through oil. He reached the bottom of the stairs and found himself in a chamber that shouldn't have existed. According to the city's geological surveys, this was solid limestone. But before him opened a vast, circular hall of smooth, white marble. It looked like the inside of a ribcage. In the center of the room was the source stone. It wasn't a grand altar or a glowing gem. It was a simple, rough-hewn block of gray granite, no larger than a foot chest. But resting atop it was a massive, translucent book that seemed to be made of frozen smoke. The ledger. As Julian approached, the pages began to turn on their own, flipped by an invisible wind. He saw names flash by, millions of them, written in a script that burned his eyes. Suddenly, the book stopped. The page was blank, save for a single jagged line of gold ink that was slowly turning black. Vance. Julian. Wait. Julian gasped. Beneath his name, another line was forming. Debt. 1 life, Marcus Vance. Interest. 1 grace, Ariel. The air in the room suddenly thickened. Julian felt a crushing pressure on his chest, as if the entire weight of the cathedral above were resting on his shoulders. He fell to his knees, gasping for air. "You are an architect," a voice boomed, not in his ears, but in his bones. It was the same voice from his dream. The source. "You know that a structure built on a faulty foundation cannot stand. You are the fault, Julian Vance." "I didn't ask for this." Julian screamed at the empty air. "I didn't ask to be saved. And yet, you took the breath. You took the years. You built your towers on the silence of your brother." The white walls of the chamber began to flicker. Images projected themselves onto the marble. Marcus, cold and blue under the ice. Ariel, bleeding gold in the rain. Every person Julian had ever loved, suffering because he was still alive. The weight increased. Julian's forehead touched the cold marble. He felt his ribs begin to groan. This was the correction. The universe was literally crushing the anomaly out of existence. "Surrender the line," the voice commanded. "Let the ink dry." Julian reached out, his fingers trembling, moving toward the ledger. If he touched the page, he could close the book. He could end the pain. He could let the math be right again. But then, he felt a spark. It was small, no more than a pinprick of heat in the center of his chest. The tether. Even through the stone and the silence, he could feel Ariel. He felt Ariel's stubbornness. He felt the way Ariel had looked at the piece of toast in the cabin. The wonder of a being who had discovered that a single bite of bread was worth falling for. "No," Julian wheezed. He forced his head up. He dug his nails into the marble floor. "The math is wrong," Julian said, his voice a ragged growl. "You built a world of laws, but you forgot the variable. You forgot that we choose." He lunged forward, throwing his body against the source stone. He didn't reach for the book to close it. He reached for the heavy, jagged tool on his belt, his steel drafting compass. He didn't use it to write. He jammed the sharp point into the palm of his own hand. Red blood, dark, human, and messy, dripped onto the smoke-colored page. "I'm not a gift," Julian roared, the pressure in the room reaching a deafening crescendo. "And I'm not a debt. I'm the owner of this life. I sign for it." The red blood hit the gold ink. The reaction was violent. A flash of purple and crimson light erupted from the stone, throwing Julian backward. The ledger shrieked, its pages tearing as the smoke turned to solid vellum. The red blood didn't wash away the gold, it bound to it, turning the script into a deep, permanent bronze. The pressure vanished. The silence returned, but this time it was a peaceful silence. The heartbeat of the room changed from a frantic thud to a steady, calm rhythm. Julian lay on his back, staring up at the white ceiling. His hand was throbbing, but for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a ghost. He felt heavy. He felt real. He felt legal. A shadow fell over him. He looked up, expecting Cassius with his needle. Instead, it was Ariel. He was leaning against the doorway, his hoodie torn, his shoulder stained with dried gold. His violet eyes were gone. They were a warm, human hazel now. He looked exhausted, battered, and utterly magnificent. "The ledger," Ariel whispered, nodding toward the stone. The book was closed. On the cover, the bronze seal was set. "It's finished," Julian said, pushing himself up. "The debt is paid. In full." Ariel walked over, his steps heavy and slightly clumsy. He sat down on the floor next to Julian and leaned his head on Julian's shoulder. "I can't feel the frequencies anymore," Ariel said, a small, tired smile on his lips. "I can't hear the stars. It's so quiet, Julian." Julian wrapped his arm around the former angel, pulling him close. "Is that okay?" Ariel closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of Julian's leather jacket and the dust of the cathedral. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Epilogue: The Architecture of Tomorrow. 1 year later. The restoration of St. Jude's Cathedral was finally complete. The scaffolding was gone, the stone was scrubbed clean, and the new gargoyles, including one with a suspiciously symmetrical, beautiful face, watched over the city. Julian Vance stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the spire. He had a new scar on his palm, but he didn't look like a man haunted by ghosts anymore. A man walked up beside him, carrying 2 cups of steaming coffee. He wore a thick wool coat and a scarf, and he was currently squinting at a bakery window with intense concentration. "The one with the cinnamon," Ariel said, pointing. "It has the most input." Julian laughed, taking his coffee. "You've been human for a year, Ariel. You'd think you'd be over the cinnamon rolls by now." "Never," Ariel said, taking a sip and sighing with content. They started walking down the street, merging into the crowd of umbrellas and coats. No one looked at them twice. To the world, they were just 2 men sharing a morning in the city. The tether was still there, of course. Julian could feel it every time Ariel laughed or grew cold. But it wasn't a chain anymore. It was a foundation. As they crossed the street, a small boy tripped on the curb, dropping his toy car. Ariel stopped, picked it up, and handed it back to the child with a wink. The boy's mother thanked him and moved on. "You couldn't help yourself?" Julian asked, smiling. Ariel shrugged, his hazel eyes bright with a very human mischief. "Old habits die hard. Besides, the ledger is closed, Julian. But that doesn't mean the poem is finished." They walked on, disappearing into the heart of the city they had both, in their own way, fallen for. The math was finally right. The end.